Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm your host, Samantha Reigle. I've spent more than 20 years as a mediator helping people resolve conflict, but here on this podcast, I talk about why conflict and any distress of any kind shows up at all, and how changing the way you respond can make your life a whole lot easier. So something I wanted to talk about today is, even if we don't see it every day in our own personal lives, I think a lot of the big messaging we're getting right now externally is how divided we really all are in this moment. And it could be red versus blue. I think especially we're seeing it in politics. There's so much polarization. And what I mean by that is it's just not people having different views and opinions. That's kind of always been true. We're all different. But there's this level of vitriol, cruelty attached to it now that makes people retreat so far into their corners that we're not even attempting to even understand each other anymore. We've stopped dialoguing with one another. We've stopped willing to sit inside our discomfort of difference, right? Believe me, I feel it too. I've noticed in myself a reluctance to engage with people who don't see certain issues the way that I do. On some level, it doesn't even feel like it's worth my time or effort. And I think it's because there's this belief that I've always carried where I should only put my energy into people where there's alignment, right? And honestly, that belief has served me well. And in many ways, it's reduced unnecessary friction. It's allowed me to build relationships that feel coherent and supportive instead of adversarial. But as I always explain, conflict itself is one of the most powerful catalysts for evolution, because embedded inside conflict is the opportunity, a portal to examine your beliefs, your reactions, and your patterns. And when you walk through that portal consciously, you don't lose yourself. You actually expand. You open into new ways of seeing, responding, and experiencing reality. So the real question right now isn't just why polarization exists. The question is, how do we respond to it? There's so much on the line right now. Staying true to your beliefs feels less like a preference and more like it's a moral imperative. It can feel almost impossible not to retreat when you're confronted with people who excuse behavior that you find personally deeply disturbing. Whether it's dismissing associations with Epstein, justifying killing of human beings in the name of immigration enforcement, or overlooking leaders accepting personal gain, profiting in exchange for political influence. These aren't abstract disagreements we're having. These are fractures that strike at our sense of what is right and what is tolerable. And so when you retreat, it feels like protection. And when I say retreat, I mean only associating with folks that share the same views and shutting out those who don't. It feels like you're maintaining your integrity. It feels like refusing to be contaminated by something that feels coercive. I'm not putting my energy in that, because the alternative, at least on the surface, feels dangerous to associate with that. It's almost like you can feel like if you do associate with that, you're opening yourself up to being influenced or diluted or pulled away from what you know to be true. But what if responding differently doesn't require you to abandon your values? What if there are ways to engage or at least orient yourself that don't weaken your integrity, but actually strengthen it? Because the reality is, it's always how we respond that determines whether we stay trapped inside a loop or break free from it. Polarization thrives on distance. It feeds on separation. The further we retreat from each other into our respective corners and stay distant, the more permanent and immovable those corners begin to feel. The divide hardens. The other side becomes less human, less reachable, and less real. Just naturally, that's what's going to happen. This is exactly what I see as a mediator when parties are entrenched in their versions of the conflict, their stories. They become so intractable. It's not that a solution doesn't exist. It's often sitting right there in front of them on the table, but they can't see it. They're so fused with their narrative. What happened? Who's wrong? Who was harmed? Who deserves restitution? And that resolution that's sitting right there on the table feels impossible. And here's what's fascinating. The more they repeat their story, the more rigid it becomes, because the story starts to serve their identity. They become the betrayed one, the wronged one, the righteous one, the powerless one. And once that identity fuses with their story, their movement's going to stop. They're going to stand still in that conflict, sometimes for years. So my job as the mediator is not to force any kind of agreement. It's not to tell anyone that they're wrong. It's to gently interrupt that intractability, that entrenchment into their story. I don't let them sit in the same loop unchecked. I ask different questions. I separate facts from interpretations. I help them look at the same situation from a different vantage point. I give them tools to see their role. Not in a blame way. I don't want people to feel any kind of blame. I want them to feel empowered, that they do have the power to change. So when they begin to tell themselves a new story with my prodding, something does shift. They can move from being a martyr to an agent, from this was done to me to what can I do now? And that powerlessness to feeling powerful, it's kind of profound to watch. Because once someone shifts internally, the conflict often softens without anyone having to concede their core values. The entrenchment into their stories or their version of it loosens and movement becomes possible. And here's the bridge back to the bigger picture. When we refuse to shift our story in the larger cultural conflicts happening right now, we do the same thing that those entrenched parties do in a mediation. We harden. We identify with the wound. We amplify the grievance, and we rehearse our righteousness. And we become unable to see options that might actually be able to move us forward. That's how polarization sustains itself, right? It doesn't even need any new offenses. It just feeds on repetition, on distance, on identity fused with grievance. And when that happens, polarization keeps running on autopilot. So if we want something different, if we want to loosen the grip that polarization has on us, we have to do what I ask my mediation parties to do. We have to experiment with responding differently. I'm not talking about agreeing with each other. I'm not even talking about persuading. No abandoning of what we believe. I'm talking about interrupting the automatic reactions that keep that conflict loop intact, that keep that perception of reality intact, that's no longer serving us and making us honestly feel like shit. And the moment that you shift your internal posture, even slightly, the entire field of the conflict changes. And that's where possibility opens. Because coherence, the opposite of polarization, will not emerge from forcing agreement. It emerges from disrupting the emotional patterns that keep us locked in opposition. And to do that, I think it would be helpful if at this point we separate into two different arenas where we're seeing polarization show up in our lives. Right? We have this external polarization that's happening. And these are the stories that we encounter in the media, the headlines, the scandals, the corruption, the things happening out there They feel horrific enough to demand our attention, even when they don't directly affect us personally, right? And then we have this other second version of polarization that's happening more internally and relational with each other and our own, and it's hitting us personally. So those are the moments where polarization shows up directly in your own life with your own family members and friends, coworkers, people you encounter face to face. And I think we have to separate these two types of polarization when we're talking about different ways to respond. So let's start with external. Think about how you normally respond when you see a story about a politician excusing a bribe or using their position for personal gain. Even if that doesn't affect your life directly, it might still invoke a reaction from you because on some level it feels personal, like your taxes are paying their salary, right? And you trust in a part of the system that they're operating within. So what happens inside of you when you see that? Maybe it's disgust, anger. Maybe you go online and name call or vent to friends, or you disengage altogether, tuning it out, shutting it out. Maybe it's activism, writing letters, protesting, speaking out. And I want to be clear, none of these responses are wrong, but they do have trade-offs. Because many of these responses, while completely understandable, can keep you energetically tethered to the very polarization that's causing the distress in the first place. Okay? Can you see that? Can you see when you are having these types of responses, how you're energetically tying yourself to these events? And it reinforces the emotional loop of outrage, helplessness, and separation. So if your goal is to not just react, but to expand, to build coherence within yourself, you have to experiment with responses that interrupt the loop. And when I talk about coherence, I mean this. Your thoughts, emotions, nervous system, and actions are aligned instead of at war with each other. You can feel strongly without losing yourself. You can witness something disturbing without your body going into full flight or fight. Your response matches your values. Your adrenaline's not going to run the show. So when you're coherent, you're oriented. When you're polarized, you're hooked. And once you understand that, the question becomes practical. How do you actually build that steadiness in real time when things are happening and you're hearing about it for the first time? You know, there's a few different ways. Maybe the first could be you observe without immediate emotional fusion. So you don't attach yourself personally to every news event. Try not to immediately see yourself inside the story. It's hard because we're human and we're empathetic. But this is going to take a conscious effort, especially if you're highly empathetic. Not every fracture that's happening in society right now requires you to merge your identity with it. And that doesn't mean you don't care. It doesn't mean you minimize harm. It means you're allowing yourself to see clearly without instantly collapsing into rage or despair. When you're fusing emotionally with every fracture that you witness, you lose your orientation. Your nervous system fires, your body tightens, your thinking narrows. You become reactive instead of deliberate. And once you're reactive, you're no longer choosing your response. You're being pulled by it. So observing without fusion creates just enough space between stimulus and reaction that you can ask, what is actually happening? What is mine to do here? Is this calling for action awareness or simply witnessing? And that small gap, that pause, is where coherence is built. It's extremely powerful because once you're not emotionally entangled with every headline, you can regain your clarity. And clarity is what allows you to respond in ways that are effective instead of just expressive. So that's the shift from expressive reaction to intentional response. And the trade-off for approaching it this way and taking that pause is that this can feel at first like detachment, like you don't care enough, like you're not appropriately outraged. And then a culture that we're all living in that rewards visible outrage, it can feel immoral. But I'm telling you, what you gain is clarity, and clarity allows for more precise, effective action when action is actually needed. Let me give you an example. I practiced this when DOGE at the beginning of 2025 was tearing through federal departments in ways that felt to me very reckless. You know, we're talking about programs that secure nuclear warheads, departments that model weather patterns and predict catastrophic flooding, the same kind of flooding that devastated communities in Texas and killed so many little girls. I mean, the list could go on. And my instinctive reaction was disgust, sense of chaos, feeling of how can this level of ineptness even be real? My own mental spiral was beginning, my own emotional entanglement. I was completely overwhelmed. I felt it in my body, the tightening in my chest. My mental loop was, this is insane, this is dangerous, this is unforgivable. And you know what? I stopped. I stopped it. Not because I didn't care, but because I cared too much to let my nervous system hijack my thinking. And when I interrupted that emotional spiral and tried to move towards clarity instead of outrage, something really uncomfortable surfaced. And I'll tell you, I have believed for a very long time that government, as structured as it is structured today, hasn't really worked for a lot of us. Maybe for a few, but there are a lot of people in society who don't feel like their representatives represent their interests. And I've felt for a long time that reform to our government was necessary because I believe that our systems have calcified. I believe disruption is something the only way that we're going to be able to expose what's unsustainable. Probably why Trump was elected. I mean, he's a disruptor. So if I'm being honest, part of me has always known that real change wouldn't come gently. Systems that are so deeply entrenched rarely loosen their grip without pressure. And sometimes that pressure looks like chaos, disruption, collapse. We have people and entire institutions clinging tightly to what no longer works. And history tells us that when that happens, the transformation's not going to be all tidy. So here's the shift. Once I stopped drowning in disgust, I could see that my reaction alone wasn't helping me assess what was actually happening. And when I interrupted that emotional spiral, I gained enough steadiness to ask better questions. And the better questions are where clarity begins. I could ask, is this destruction or exposure? Is this incompetence or a stress test? Is this collapsed, or is it a forced reckoning within the systems that were already brittle? And that doesn't mean I approve of chaos. It doesn't mean I dismiss the real harm that happens when systems fail. It means I zoomed out enough to see that sometimes collapse reveals what incremental reform never could. If a structure can't withstand pressure without disintegrating, that tells you something about the structure. And we're talking about our government. It's what we had in place, the decorum, the agreement that we would all abide by this Constitution and Bill of Rights. Is it able to stand this disruption, or is it collapsing? Was it never really sturdy to begin with? So I've been saying for years that our systems need radical change. Then I've been willing to examine what that radical change can actually look like when it's messy and destabilizing. That shift alone took me out of helpless rage and into sober assessment. And from there, my responses became more intentional. Instead of doom scrolling and amplifying outrage, with conversations with friends or family, I'm not a big, commenter on social media, but I do express my opinions to my close circle. I just stopped all that. And I asked myself, where can my energy actually create leverage? Where would my voice have impact? What conversations are mine to have, and which ones are just feeding the algorithm of chaos? Hello, I have a podcast. I can talk about this. That's where my energy is most effective. That clarity allowed me to separate symbolic panic from strategic concern. It allowed me to say some things require action, some things require watchfulness, and some things require patience when systems are revealing themselves. When you interrupt that emotional spiral, you don't become indifferent, you become deliberate. And being deliberate is quite powerful. Your outrage is going to burn really fast. It's going to make you feel righteous. It's going to bind you to your tribe. But it's also going to exhaust you and keep you locked inside that same polarity that you claim to reject. Clarity, on the other hand, lets you hold two truths at once. Those two truths. This may be dangerous, and this may be necessary exposure of deeper dysfunction. That dual awareness, I believe, is maturity. And from that place, you're far less likely to be manipulated by media cycles, by political rhetoric, by your own nervous system. That's the real gain. You stop being emotionally jerked around by every headline, and you start orientating yourself around principles instead of reactions. And once you're orientated around those principles and actions, and whether that's speaking out, organizing, voting, building alternatives, or simply refusing to participate in this hysteria, you will become grounded. You're no longer reacting to these fractures, these conflicts, these crises. You're responding from the portal, the doorway. You're walking through that doorway. And that is a completely different frequency of power. You are going to start seeing new perspectives. You're going to engage in new experiences that were not open to you before. It's a pretty cool trade-off, and it feels powerful. Okay, another response that you can experiment with when faced with this external polarization is just shifting from outrage to curiosity. Try this out next time you're hit with a story that's having a polarizing effect. I'm not talking about curiosity that excuses harmful behavior and not the kind of curiosity that just loops you back into your own emotional processing. I kind of already talked about that. I mean curiosity about the system itself, about the incentives, about the architecture that keeps producing the behavior you say you hate. Because outrage alone doesn't dismantle systems. Understanding them will. So what does that actually look like? Okay, let's say you're watching politicians accept money, favors, access, whatever form it takes. And your immediate reaction is, they're corrupt. And that may be true, but if you stop there, you stay in moral judgment. Curiosity is going to ask different questions. Curiosity looks like asking these types of questions. Maybe, what are the incentives built into this government that reward this kind of behavior? How is the power in our country structured in a way that makes this advantageous? And who benefits when outrage is loud and then reform is vague? Is this government system that we're all in designed to self-correct or to self-protect? And what conditions would actually make this behavior costly instead of profitable? That shift into curiosity and being curious and questioning the system itself, rather than assigning your moral story to the event itself, will move you and shift you from character assassination to structural analysis. Let's look at something like extreme partisanship. Instead of saying these people are brainwashed when you're talking about the other side, be curious. Ask a question like, what media ecosystems are they living in? How are their algorithms feeding them? And what fears are being activated in them? What identity threats are being leveraged? And when you get curious about incentives and design, you start to see that individuals are often operating rationally within a broken structure. I'm not saying this to absolve them, but it reveals leverage points, because if behavior is being rewarded, the real question becomes, how do we change the reward system? If corruption is profitable, how do we make integrity profitable? If division drives engagement, how do we stop feeding the engagement machine? If outrage generates clicks, how do we stop monetizing our own nervous systems? That's where insight becomes power. The trade-off is discomfort, because curiosity requires you to move closer to something you'd rather reject entirely. It means resisting the simplicity of evil people doing evil things and sitting inside a more complicated truth of these systems that we've all agreed to, media, social media, government, all produce predictable outcomes. And complexity is less emotionally satisfying than outrage. Outrage feels clean. It feels righteous. It bonds you to your tribe. Curiosity feels destabilizing. It forces you to admit that the problem might be bigger than the villain. It may require you to examine how you too participate through attention, through consumption, through silence, through amplification. But what you gain is leverage. When you understand the system, you stop swinging at symptoms and start identifying pressure points. And pressure points are where change actually happens. That's the difference between being emotionally correct and being strategically effective. Okay? Another response you could have that I want to throw out there that might be worth trying out is choosing intentional action instead of reflective action. And that might mean, supporting those organizations that are aligning with your values, and then economically pulling back from organizations or companies that do not. It might also look like having grounded conversations instead of explosive ones with those that don't have the same viewpoint as you. Or channeling your energy into building something new instead of only opposing what exists. The trade-off to this type of response is that it's slower, it's emotionally less satisfying in the moment, but it's far more stabilizing over time. All of these different responses that I just went over basically point back to reclaiming your own internal coherence, regardless of the external chaos. Because when you remain internally stable, even while witnessing instability, you stop feeding the polarization. You stop amplifying it through your own nervous system. And this is where your power actually is. Not in controlling what's happening out there, but in choosing how you respond to it. Because every response either reinforces the loop or interrupts it. And when people begin interrupting the loop, polarization itself becomes unsustainable. As we close this conversation, it's my genuine intention that you walk away feeling hopeful. I'm not saying everything out there is fine. It's definitely not. And not because polarization is going to magically dissolve. It won't. But because you have more influence over the field than you think. Every time you choose coherence over reactivity, curiosity over outrage, or clarity over emotional fusion, you are interrupting a pattern that has been running on autopilot for far too long. And that matters. It's going to matter in your home. It's going to matter in your conversations. It's going to matter in the way that you consume media. And when enough of us start responding differently, polarization will lose its grip. I'm not saying this as a fantasy. That's actually how systems shift. That's how conflict shifts. If you leave here with anything, let it be this: you are not powerless inside this moment. Guys, until next week, don't react, but let's try and respond with intention.